you. Thank you very much, everyone. It's really lovely to be here today. And I think I snuck into the very end of Tim Oates' talk because I wanted to change a few of my slides, as you do. And he was talking about comparisons with different nations. And it's true to say that there has been a bit of an earthquake in English education in the last little while. And although my current work is working sort of on development of national curriculums in different jurisdictions, probably the reason I've been invited here today was because in my own way, I was lucky enough to be part of that revolution at different points, working with Ofsted that drove a focus on knowledge and inspection of curriculum, and then working for a very successful multi-academy trust, ARC, which is, of its size of MAT, the most successful at primary in the country. And having visited so many schools through my roles, as well as that work in ARC, it's very evident why it is that there are groups of schools that are doing exceptionally well in England, standing out in terms of the progress that they're achieving for pupils. You know, we think about flight paths, changing the trajectory of those flight paths for those children in really radical ways. And really, it's through what we could call a knowledge-rich curriculum. The bits of that, the building blocks, can sound quite mundane, and it can be quite hard to express what it is that the change is. But I'll do my very best today to do so with you. Over Christmas, not long ago, my family, we were playing board games, as you often do at Christmas, and we were playing a particular game. I should just... Here we go. Yeah, we were playing a particular game called Articulate Phrases, which is a little bit like, you know, the old TV show Catchphrase. And so you're in a team and you have to get your everyone else in your team to guess the catchphrase which you're describing, but you can't actually use the words of the catchphrase. And I was playing with my husband, and we were playing against our 3 children, who were then they were then 21, 19, and 17. No, sorry, 21, 19, and 15. So we were playing against them, and I was really acing it. I was doing really well. My then 15-year-old son said that I was the MVP, the most valuable player. And he said he wanted to change teams to play with me. And you can imagine that warm glow you get when your grown-up children think that you're actually worth something and, you know, you've got something to contribute to life. So I was really chuffed. And so we reconfigured the teams, and my son and I played against my husband and daughters. Oh, God. We crashed and burned. We did incredibly badly. My daughter said I was the LVP, the least valuable player. And it wasn't great. I let my son down, which was exactly what I wouldn't have wanted to do in those circumstances. But why? What was it that happened that moved me from MVP to LVP? Well, it's one thing, isn't it, to kind of share associated knowledge with the decades-long partner of your life about catchphrases you're fairly sure they know. It's something quite different to try to kind of stumble towards guessing what your 15-year-old son might know, to help him guess at catchphrases you're really not sure he even knows. And why am I telling this story? I think you probably, from Christine's talk and many others, already know why I'm telling this story now. Because we make sense of all that we encounter in the world, what we hear, what we see, and what we read, using what we already know. So in the case of reading, that's reading comprehension. It's about associations of what we already know that gives meaning to the new. And in this case, that illustrates what was going on with the catchphrase situation here. And it's only too easy to overestimate what our children do actually have associations with. So, for example, when we're planning that lovely Primary 1 role play corner, do those children have the rich associations that we as adults have with the planning for that corner? And a lot of the fun and the excitement almost comes from the associations we have sometimes, rather than a presumption about the associations that the children might have. often there's a lot to explain when we're teaching something new, and perhaps more to explain than we think. And another example of this, I was very originally a history teacher by trade, and that word government, when Christine mentioned that, made me smile because that was my example I was going to be using. Thank you, Christine. And I just remembered there was a real moment in my teaching where it was a sort of turning point. And I used to teach Germany, you know, you teach the Nazis, whatever, and from 1918 onwards. And I'd say that after 1918 in Germany, government broke down. And for the first few years of my career, I didn't really think much about it. I just said it, we'd move on, and then we'd sort of get stuck somewhere in the late 1920s and they'd really be struggling with understanding. And it was only some years into my career that I kind of realised, what do they even understand by the word government? Not as much, hopefully, as if they'd had that rich primary education that Christine gave the vision of. Let alone, what do they think might be meant by government breaking down? What possible reference points do they have to understand that? And when I actually thought about that, when I backward planned my curriculum, we all know that, of course, you plan to ensure that children learn the next bit. I mean, that's obvious, isn't it, to any teacher? But there is a revelation here which is more than that. If we really backwards plan. So when we think about those schools that have been very successful in England, yes, there was a principle. We all as teachers knew that principle. What made the difference to those schools that I visited as an Ofsted inspector, visited to compile subject reports that have been most successful? It was this really planning backwards, really thinking about what it meant to identify what that content was, which is the next step for those children. And that's why a high quality curriculum is so important, because it identifies what knowledge our students need and how it will be built over time. I've prepared this illustration, which might actually, with Christine's talk, be less needed, but we'll just do it briefly. 3 words here. A prince, poetry, and a plant. And I'd like you to have a think, and if there's someone next to you that you can talk with, have a talk with them, about what the typical P1 child might understand of one of those words. Pick whichever you want. You know, what associations they might have. And then discuss what the typical child, as they leave primary and enter post-primary education, what associations they might have for that word. Over to you just for a moment. Okay, I'm sure there's endless things you could talk about, but just giving yourself kind of flavour of the idea of what I'm getting at here. Third question, and just think about this one for yourself for a moment. And this kind of echoes the message that Christine has already given. She didn't share her slides with me in advance. But what would your associations be with that word? Do you remember Christine gave that example of her associations with sacrifice? And you could have carried on writing forever, really. You could have filled a whole screen with it. You could have carried on just endless associations that you have, that you've picked up one way or another. And it's an interesting question about where you pick that up, because some of those things we obviously pick up through daily life, but schooling is to help us pick up those associations that we won't pick up in other ways, that give us access to adult life, give us access to further study, give us choices, and allow us to take part in adult society and be fulfilled, take pleasure in ideas, for example, draw comfort through life. So the exercise illustrates that what progression can look like in a curriculum, how each new encounter that we have with another association adds to the schema, the complexity of our understanding, that web of knowledge. And children's capacity to learn actually increases. Because it's a marvel, isn't it? How on earth have we got to the stage where you really do have all those associations? How is that even statistically possible to acquire all that knowledge? And it's a bit like, you know, a snowball. You start small, you roll it, and it just gets bigger the more you roll it. Or another, to mix my metaphors, hooks. The more hooks you've got to hook new knowledge onto, the more knowledge you can learn. It's multiplicative. So you really can acquire this kind of astronomical amount of knowledge that you have for these associations. And so if children don't learn what we hoped, then maybe they didn't have the prior knowledge necessarily to understand what was taught. This is my own version now of the slide that Christine shared. So a child whose schooling doesn't, at the end of their schooling, allow them to plot a straight line graph, to explain a complex scientific concept, to have comprehension of complex text, their mental schema is more limited. That's the one thing we do know for sure. We might have all explanations for why they didn't acquire that knowledge, but what we do know is that their mental schema is limited. And what we can say with insight from research on human cognition is that weak outcomes are due to knowledge gaps. We know that is the schema, of the lesser schema, not literally, but the lesser schema is what children that are not being successful have relative to the schema of the child that's more successful. The one thing we can be sure of is that there are things missing that they needed to learn. So what's the magic that's led to some schools in England, in Arc, where I worked, and as I say, being very successful, and other schools that have really created totally different trajectories for children and created really a whole new movement in education through doing that, which other jurisdictions have been wanting to emulate. You know, what is it that's made that difference? It's this insight and how we break that down. And a knowledge-rich curriculum, it can mean different things. So when we're thinking about a knowledge-rich curriculum, we might just be thinking, well, they're going to learn a lot. And that's true. I mean, yeah, you obviously, the more you know, the more you can learn. You learn a lot. But there are other insights that are under that kind of heading knowledge-rich curriculum. One is the application of the research we have on human cognition, cognitive psychology, not just to how we teach, pedagogy. You know, there's a lot of research on the effectiveness of explicit instruction, which is quite challenging to orthodoxies. So not just that, but implications for curriculum as well. And I'm going to be talking about those implications of research from cognitive psychology. And another area that's very influential when thinking about knowledge rich is the implications for acknowledging the importance of subject. And I'm going to be talking a bit more about that as well, because that's a real change as well and was in England. So I've said that the one thing we can be sure of is that weak outcomes are due to knowledge gaps, and that there are implications for that for a theory of change for school improvement. And just to say one thing here about that, when I'm talking about curriculum, I could be talking under knowledge-rich curriculum. I could be talking at different levels. I could be talking about a national curriculum which expresses some high-level outcomes. I could be talking about the curriculum offer of a school, you know, what subjects we teach to what children at what ages. I could be talking about our decisions about what the topic should be in our kind of our curriculum, if we give it a heading, social studies or history or whatever the heading is that we give for, or even just topic that we give for the what we're covering. You know, what are those topics, in what order and why? But it can also be talking about that curriculum or what question, be very granular, and that's probably, you know, one way in which it's very powerful within even a sequence of lessons. Curriculum is that what question, and a really expert teacher will, even if they don't realise they're doing it, they think, this is where I want to get in this sequence of lessons. Therefore, if I teach them this, they want to do this. Then if I emphasise that, then I'll make sure they really get that, and then we'll get there. There are a series of what questions there, and those could also come under the heading of curriculum, and are also significant questions and really affect the quality of education that children get within, you know, sequence of lessons. You know, that's the size at which it comes for pupils, what they're learning. So if children haven't learned what we might hope, haven't got as far, their trajectory has either gone down or hasn't gone up from where we might hope it would be. What might that be? We can think about that in curricular terms. Perhaps the content wasn't identified and taught, perhaps it didn't receive necessary emphasis, Perhaps the building blocks chosen weren't right or the right size of content. Perhaps it was a bit muddled. Not taught using effective teaching methods, not deeply embedded so it can be really remembered. But something at this level does explain why those knowledge gaps exist, why our children haven't necessarily learned as much as we would hope. I was looking at the Northern Ireland inspection reports, obviously, having worked for Ofsted, which is quite curious. And so I was having a little look to understand a little bit more about inspection and what tend to be kind of areas of focus in reports. And there were these areas of concern that were some of the patterns that I saw coming out from those reports, and I wouldn't be critical of that in any way. Low expectations, perhaps limited differentiation, not enough formative assessment, low challenge. Fine. But what I would say is that we need to think about the teacher that gets this feedback, and we need to think about what it would mean for them to change their behaviour. Low expectations of what? What was it they were doing? What should it be that they're teaching? What's the change in expectation? What is that content that's changing? Limited differentiation. What should they be learning instead of what they're learning? What would that look like? Not enough formative assessment. Of what? What needs to be assessed? What are those building blocks? And I would suggest from my experience of visiting many schools, and particularly then some really detailed work in ARC, that generally when teachers aren't doing formative assessment, it's not because they forgot or they weren't intellectually convinced that it was important. It's because they're not sure what to assess. What are those little building blocks? What is it that needs to be checked? Unless you're really clear and you've got a real sense of conviction that that is what needs to be learned, then what are you checking? And so a lot of time formative assessment doesn't happen. And if you scratch the surface and you talk about the lesson afterwards, you say, what is it you could have formatively assessed? You might not get a very clear answer back. Or certainly that's my experience, very commonly. And so there's a what question. So behind apparent pedagogical weaknesses can sit curricular problems. And it's addressing these curricular problems which is at the heart of the kind of movement that I've been talking about that has had this impact on education and on the trajectories of children. Okay, a bit more about subject and progression and what that can look like. I'd like you to take a look at these two mugshots on the screen. The first person pictured is Albert Einstein, and I chose him because he doesn't need an introduction. And the second is someone called Jaime Escalante, and he was a remarkable maths teacher, worked in Los Angeles, really turned around the outcomes of inner city kids, so they were able to do high-level mathematics. It's made into a film in 1988 called Stand and Deliver, but obviously a superb maths teacher. So these are my two mugshots, and just a rhetorical question for you. Which of these two pictured would be more likely to write good maths planning at the levels that you might want? Einstein had huge expertise in maths. That doesn't mean he knew what you need to teach a child step by step towards expertise. You do need expertise in maths. You can't teach the maths if you don't understand it yourself. So we're not saying you don't need expertise, that's not the message. So you do need expertise, but of these two, I'm pretty sure that you'll choose number two. You choose Jaime to write the curriculum planning. And I bet he'd know exactly what those kids needed to learn step by step to get better. Say we add Ruth Miskin to the mugshot mix here. She's going to be delivering the talk at the end of the day today. I'm going to have to get out of the way quickly so I don't overrun ready for her. And she's an expert in phonics. She's written this enormously successful program, Read Write Inc. And so she must be a skilled teacher. She must be, otherwise she couldn't have written something so very successful that's had a real impact. But would we choose her to do the maths planning? No. Even though she's a great teacher, we wouldn't choose her. So it wasn't the subject's expertise per se, although you do need to understand the maths. It wasn't teacher skill, alone, because Ruth Miskin wouldn't be the best for the maths planning. Jaime's better. What's making him better still? So for maths planning, we'd still want him because he'd have a strong, what we might call mental model or knowledge of progression in maths. I bet that at each teaching moment, he'd know exactly what those children needed next. And from this little exercise, we can see that knowledge of subject itself, that an expert would hold, is not the same as the teacher's knowledge of curriculum that pupils need to learn step by step over time to reach the desired level of expertise in whatever it is, the subject. And teachers need to know those steps in subject content that takes the child from novice to expert. And that's a different kind of knowledge. I've dubbed this knowledge curriculum journey knowledge. There are other terms that are used to describe teacher knowledge, like pedagogical content knowledge you might have come across, for example. But they don't narrow in on specifically on quite this idea of the series of interconnected knowledge steps that, if learned over time, move pupils further towards subject expertise. And it's knowledge of those learning steps and then effectively delivering them that changes those trajectories. You are making sure that step by step, infallibly, those children are learning the schema that you feel confident will lead to expertise. I mentioned that question, why is it that this doesn't happen at the moment? Why doesn't every child come out with the schema that we want for whatever it is that we want expertise for them in? And one reason I gave was that maybe the knowledge wasn't identified. And it's worth saying that, in subjects like maths or in science, there are quite well-known sequences of content. So on the face of it, can sound a bit funny to say knowledge wasn't identified. But if we think about other subjects, what about religious studies? What about PE? What about English? If we think about what's said about reading comprehension earlier, have we really thought about what those actual building blocks are towards expertise? And there is a difference in those. Those building blocks, there's a piece of terminology that's just really useful, components. It can be really useful, rather than sort of saying building blocks, to say that there are components that together can combine towards a more complex outcome, whether that be a skill, whether we describe that as a skill, whether it's a more complex understanding of something, the capacity to perform in a certain way. We can combine those building blocks towards something more complex. And so that is a really useful bit of terminology. Here, I've got some possible concepts that could be learned from studying, it's actually the Romans. When we're planning our curriculum for our children, we might be thinking, well, okay, yeah, I kind of know what topics they're going to do, but what's the level of planning and what level of ambition in terms of what it is that children might take away from what they're learning? And how likely is it that that's going to lead towards the kind of expert schema that means they're going to understand something in history and indeed across other subjects, because you can see how that would feed in, that's more complex later down the line, and therefore be more successful. Just a word here about subject, actually, because when we began developing a new inspection framework at Ofsted with a focus on curriculum, so the last inspection framework, though that focus on curriculum has remained in the new one, which is just being implemented at the moment. But when we were developing that framework, most primary schools in England taught topic. Most primary schools taught individual topics, and I think my understanding is that that's pretty typical here, that generally it'd be topic. And in Ofsted, what we said was, you can deliver a subject-specific curriculum, or you can deliver through topic. Ofsted doesn't have a preferred style that you need or preferred curriculum structure that you must follow. But what we did say is, however, within what you teach, there needs to be progression, and there are subject-specific forms of progression that are going to need to be catered for through your planning. And so, I mean, to be honest, I think that's harder to do through topic. And perhaps that's why English schools have kind of pretty much turned around and largely now teach through subject. That was never a requirement of Ofsted that would happen. But that is the noticeable trend we've seen through our subject reporting, which was work that I was doing within Ofsted, that is what's happened. But what I would say is this planning of these components over time is going to be powerful for your pupils. It is going to make a difference. And so it is worth thinking about how that might be possible and what that means. So just going to ping through a few of those, just in a little bit more detail about that question of if children haven't acquired the schema, what might have gone wrong? I talked about components. It's worth thinking about whether the components that you've identified in whatever the subject is, are they small enough? I've got this analogy of the staircase for giants, which is what I've tried to picture here. I think a lot of the time in our education, in different subjects, we present to the child what we think they need to learn next. And it's actually quite indigestible for them. It's quite a big chunk of stuff for them to be able to absorb without overwhelming their working memory. There's just too much of it to kind of absorb at once. And if you can break down whatever it is in each subject into small enough steps, it's like converting a staircase that was built for giants, creating tiny little shallow steps that any child could walk up. And then that means they can get to the top. They can go on their journey too. And one theme across the sessions that I visited, and I know a bit from talking to other speakers, is actually this. So I was in Naveen and Chris's math session, and it was about atomization. It was about how in maths, what does it mean to create the smallest enough step? Before that, I was in with David Didow talking about English writing, and he was saying exactly the same thing, but with subject-specific insight. He was sharing what those chunks are for English as opposed to what those chunks are for maths. And it's different, obviously. And he was saying, if you break down writing into these tiny chunks and make sure that each step along the way to acquiring that writing is successful, make sure that pupils practice writing correct forms to permanence rather than in reinforcing incorrect forms to permanence, and just go step by step with confidence your curriculum is taking the children in the right direction to build towards expertise, then they will get there. And so that's my staircase for giants. Another way of thinking about this is you need a sequence. The sequence needs to be appropriate. Sometimes the best way to identify that sequence is backwards planning. If I know they need to get there at the end of a really, of a sequence of lessons, what needs to have happened before in that sequence, previously in their teaching? What don't they have that I'm going to make sure they need to get? I was talking a little while ago to the maths lead at ARC, and I was asking her, what would you say is the main reason why children don't learn in a lesson what the teachers hope or think they might? And she said, I actually just think it's that their teachers perhaps just aren't clear enough about precisely what children need to learn, to have learned already, to really be able to access what's being covered now. And that's in maths where there are really quite clear sequences. But actually, back to that insight, weak outcomes and new to knowledge gaps, we do know. What she was telling me was what research in cognitive psychology tells us. Weak outcomes and new to knowledge gaps. If they didn't do well in that lesson, well, perhaps they weren't listening, but if they didn't do well and they were trying, it's because they've got knowledge gaps that mean it's inaccessible to them. We know that is true. The same across subjects. It will play out differently in terms of what the content is, but there we are. Perhaps it wasn't practiced or deeply embedded and readily recalled. David Didow said something very amusing. He was talking about capital letters, and he was talking about how, he can't write his name. He'd have to really concentrate to write his name all in lowercase without capital letters at the start of each word of the name. And that would be quite hard because it's deeply embedded. And he was saying, but a lot of children have been deeply embedded the opposite. They really struggle to write in anything but lowercase because that's deeply embedded. And every time they write, they reinforce it further. It was sad, but a real insight at the same time. But we need to work out what it is that children need to learn. And what those steps are, as small and bite-sized as possible, and make sure they're genuinely learned. Perhaps, and this is actually fairly common, perhaps there was a focus on pedagogy, like I was saying, formative assessment, differentiation, is it being done, without first identifying what it was that needs to be learned, and to inform those pedagogical decisions and make them really pertinent and thoughtful. And often forms of assessment can be defining the progression in ways that aren't helpful. So you end up practicing piles of inference rather than thinking about the long-term benefit of knowledge on increasing reading comprehension through understanding of vocabulary, for example. But it plays out across different subjects. We want to be thinking about what the actual curriculum is that builds towards expertise, not planning via kind of outcome statements, can-do statements, or I've got some of the examples of these here, blooms, and things of that sort. Okay, and I was talking about components. This is just another way of saying the same thing. The final performance tends to look different from the things we need to do to prepare for it. If we keep just re-practicing final outcomes as they're defined in mark schemes, perhaps we haven't worked out what the building blocks were that children need to learn. If I give the example of reading comprehension again, we could keep giving reading comprehension exercises. Keep saying, make some inferences, what's the main point? But actually we didn't identify that the building blocks of knowledge are the vocabulary, the knowledge over time that needs to build, that means that those ideas expressed in that text are meaningful. And ultimately that's what comprehension is. And then we're able to make inferences readily because we understand it. This means there is a limit to what summative assessments can do in terms of defining our curriculum. They're useful, as Tim Oates was saying, I was at the back of the talk, they're certainly useful, but they don't necessarily define our curriculum. We need to think about what those building blocks are. What is that curriculum journey knowledge in that subject? And that takes me to my final slide. I'm nearly on time, which I'm quite pleased about, all things considered. How can teachers gain the curriculum journey knowledge in each subject to write and deliver a high quality curriculum? How can we help them? One thing I would say, really from perhaps even bitter experience, is that if you ask your teachers, if you go home and say, yeah, I get this is really good, and you ask your teachers to design new knowledge-rich lesson level materials or sort of progressions, they might find it quite hard. And I'd suggest that's because actually they might not have the curriculum journey knowledge they need. They might probably, primary, they might not have literally the subject expertise itself. But they might not, even if they do have enough subject expertise, actually have the insight into what those steps are. And that might be a real challenge for them. So what I would say is that there's different ways forward that have worked well for schools as they've gone on a journey themselves to create better and better curriculum materials that define more and more successfully what those components are. And one is learning from the choices made by high quality curriculum supporting materials. That's what was happening in the maths session. And learning about sequences that have been highly effective from that. Sharing expertise between schools, particularly at primary level, and getting that subject expertise in that way, from post-primary schools as well, and kind of sharing out the thinking. Sometimes it means going on a journey together. None of the people in the room have all the answers, but continuing that journey and discussion of what that content might be. Obviously, external subject training. A shout out for the publications that my team was responsible for, the Ofsted research reviews and subject reports. The research reviews in particular are subject by subject. and share what the kind of research, general or subject specific, we have says about what successful progressions are. They're not curriculum documents, but they talk about what the successful progressions are, and you can find those on the gov.uk website. So documents of that sort. And finally, at ARC, I think one of the most quietly successful ways of changing the quality of teaching that we had implemented, indeed I inherited it and we worked on refining it when I took over my role, was co-planning. It's very hard to get in the room with the teacher that's not doing a great job. But a lot of the time, that meeting between more experienced teachers and less experienced teachers that are discussing something that they're all going to be teaching together and unpicking what is the component knowledge here. As I say, it's actually slightly scarily eye-opening when you have those conversations, and sometimes you realise that actually people aren't as clear. We just think we know, and we don't necessarily know what those components are that we want to land. Back to my point about formative assessment. But those co-planning conversations, supporting more experienced teachers, supporting less experienced teachers, identifying first the what are those small building blocks, and then the how, what might be the successful pedagogical approach, was very helpful. And I think I've managed to get to the end, barely overrunning. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for having me today.